الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Islamic Center at New York University podcast, coming to you straight from the heart of New York City. We're building an amazing Muslim community here at ICNYU where everyone is welcomed and respected no matter where you're from or where you're at. This is the place to be. So open your ears and your heart and come along with us on another life-changing journey. Bismillah.
Bismillah, Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So people want to pull up the text. We're looking at a book. It's called the Book of Assistance. You can just Google the Book of Assistance PDF. This is a text on spirituality. It presents spirituality in this very easily digestible chapters, really short. We've been looking at this for a while now, and we're on chapter 11 that's on doctrine. And so we're going to go into it in a bit, but where and how we can understand the text on a whole. Essentially what Imam Haddad is doing is giving us a roadmap towards spiritual increase. In Islam as a religion, there's not a separation between ritual, theology, spirituality, ethics, but these things all synergize and overlap with one another to fall within the broader framework of the religion on a whole and have to be understood in relation to one another. And if we were to give a baseline definition to spirituality, essentially it's the means through which we can ascertain meaning from the environment around us, right? And it's a mechanism that enables us to inherently see things, but see them with a depth of perspective, to not see things in a simplistic or reductive way. If you can turn to the person next to you, if you don't know their name, just exchange some names and a little bit of how your day went. But what do you think is fundamentally the difference between like faith and creed, right? Iman and Aqidah. They're two different words. They have to have different definitions. And you don't want to speak only if you know what the right thing is to say, so to speak, or avoid talking because you're worried about saying the wrong thing. We want to be able to start to build relationships with these sciences by understanding kind of terminology without ambiguity, knowing what it means so that we can deepen in our engagement of it. And faith, essentially, theology becomes the base of any religion. You know, it's what's going to make religions different from one another. So when somebody sits with me and says, well, you know, there's all these ethics and values in other religions. Yeah, like no religion owns love or compassion or mercy. If they make that claim, they're lying to you. But where religions become distinct is in their belief structure. Even monotheistic traditions, they have an essential difference in understanding of who God is, right? And so starting from like the ground up, being able to recognize. So if you turn to the person next to you, like what's the difference? You know, why are these two things termed differently? Iman and Aqidah, right? Faith and doctrine. And we can talk a little bit about it and then come back and discuss. That would be great. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, so what are some of the things we're talking about? What is the difference in these two terms? Iman, faith, Aqidah, creed, doctrine. What do you think? Yeah.
The way I understood it is that faith, like Aqidah is more of the rules that you follow, or like what constitutes the sort of skeleton of the religion, and then faith is kind of internal feeling, or like a belief. So they go hand in hand, but like one is more like spirituality, and the other one's like the rules that some guidance you follow.
Okay. What else? What else do we talk about? Yeah.
I just thought like the 60 pillars of the man and like how you look at them. Most of them are things that we have to like believe on and faith. Like we have the faith in that Allah. We have the faith and belief that in the angels and the unseen. Those are things that we take on faith, but it's that aqidah or like that's the way we practice matters of practicing the religion as opposed to belief.
Okay. Other thoughts? Yeah.
You talk about sometimes like you have one more than the other, or you do one more than the other sometimes. Sometimes like you have a faith but you're not doing the practices, and sometimes you're practicing but like you're not over there. Talk about that as well.
So let's put that here for a second. Why do you think this term develops a little bit later? Aqidah. Because Iman is there right in the beginning, right? The angel Jibreel comes to the Prophet ﷺ and asks in the foundational hadith these questions. What is Islam? What is Iman? What is Ihsan? Tell me of the hour, right? Akhbirni an al-Iman, right? Tell me what is this thing of Iman? And this is a response that comes, أن تؤمنوا بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم الآخر والقدر خير وشر, that you believe in God and His angels and His messengers and His books and the last day and divine decree, the good and the bad of it. Why does this term around creed come later, and this is not something that's like common in terms of just the day-to-day lexicon of that first generation of individuals? What do you think? Yeah.
So I think it's because like the early Sahaba were so used to the lawlessness of Mecca at that time. So it would be a lot to take in to, okay, suddenly give up alcohol, suddenly give up the culture that they've been used to their whole lives. And to completely move away from that, it takes a lot of conviction, it takes a lot of time to build that iman. And that iman needs to be strengthened in order for them to shift their mentality, to shift their habits, and to actually break away from it.
Okay. What else? What else comes to mind? Yeah.
I think like within human nature, it's easier sometimes to just like kind of approach it from a spiritual perspective, or approach it with like it seems to me like kind of just like a gentler approach to try to just bring in like the ideas and the thought process behind it first before being like these are the hard rules that you have to follow, because that can kind of deter people sometimes from just
But think about it in the prism of historical context, right? Not in the prism of an individual kind of constituent or congregant or practitioner. But as you have now the development of a community on a whole, and as time passes, there interjects itself now this terminology that wasn't utilized in the initial phase of revelation and in that time with the companions. Like, why might that be? What's going on there? Yeah.
Does it have to do with the fact that like they were still accumulating information because didn't it take many years?
So that's in the first period of revelation, right? And this term comes up after that. So the Prophet ﷺ has passed away. You know, the companions, they weren't like talking about Aqidah. Why is it coming after? Yeah.
When they had the Prophet ﷺ among them, it was always clear, understood what Aqidah was. It didn't need to be sort of defined, but once Islam started to spread, and I think the companions of one whom encountered other people and people converted, I think some people who converted might not have had a firm understanding of Aqidah, or they might have brought in understandings from their previous faiths, and things might have gotten blurred once Islam started to spread.
Yeah, great, right? There's questions that come up that weren't there before, you know, so Somebody goes to the Byzantines. The Byzantines have their own way of life. Somebody goes to the Persians. Somebody goes to the Romans. Somebody goes to Abyssinia, Ethiopia, right? Modern day Ethiopia. They're interacting now with different demographics that are going to bring up questions that weren't necessarily asked in that 23-year period of revelation. And individuals have to be able to talk about it, but also have to be able to talk about it in a mode that things become codified. That's where Aqidah systems come in, that they're giving you a codified creed, right? Because the individual practitioner needs to be able to answer a question. It still happens today. I sat down with at least 3 people in the last week and a half who they're looking into Islam, and they're coming from a either Protestant or Catholic background where Jesus as a figure is very central to their identity. And the notion of being able to understand who Jesus is vis-a-vis an Islamic framework, but also then being able to reconcile, well, what is a prophet actually in Islam? Am I turning my back on Jesus as an individual if I embrace Muhammad alayhi salam as an individual? You know, these are things that come up for people. But you think about it now on a mass level, where communities are interacting with communities. And you think about it within historical context, because Aqidah issues, faith issues, are not only attached to actions that manifest themselves, but can also be attached to that, right? So it's not just, hey, I'm a Muslim person, and this guy in Rome is asking me that, well, the Quran speaks about Jesus, the son of Mary, peace be upon both of them, in this way, and it sounds a little similar to what we claim in biblical narrative is a depiction of Christ as a representative of the speech of God. What does that mean? But also, when you get to places now where, for example, historically, you have things like the Battle of Siffin or the Battle of Jamal, and on both sides of this battle, they're Muslim people. And somebody's going to ask the question, like, how do we understand theologically somebody who could actually kill the grandson of the prophet of God at Karbala? Are we in a place where we can comment on their faith? And so there's a lot that goes on in the terms of historical context. The same way that one gets to a place of, hey, how do I pray on an airplane? How would they answer that question when there was no airplanes? Do you get what I mean? It doesn't mean you don't pray on an airplane, but somebody has to be able to still answer that question, right? A lot of us have flown on airplanes. I go on an airplane almost like once a week sometimes, right? I gotta know, how do I pray on an airplane? And just as those legalistic questions are being asked, so too now these theological questions, as they come into interaction with other philosophies, other paradigms, other religious, spiritual communities, they're coming up. And the fundamental idea is that there now has to be something that's codified, that says this is who God is in Islam. This is what we mean when we say God. Does that make sense? Like if somebody asked you, what is the definition of God in Islam? What would you say? It's not a trick question. Yeah.
I was just gonna say like the creator of everything.
That's the definition that's also in other religions. Do you see? Let's do this for a second, just as an exercise. Don't feel uncomfortable. You're just talking to the people around you, right? If my 7-year-old came up to you and asked you, like, what is a laptop? And you gave him a definition. What is a cell phone? And you gave him a definition. And he said, what is God? What is the definition you would give to that term? Not like anything other than think in your head as an exercise. You opened up a dictionary that was Islamic terms, and you're now defining like the concept of a God in Islam. Does the question make sense? Right? which is very different from just like speaking solely about the essential attributes of God. But if someone said like the definition of God in Islam, right? Or kind of as close to as you could, how would you answer that on a defining level? Do you see what I mean? Because that's what some of these people are wrestling with, right? And it's not that it's always antagonistic, but they're coming into interactions with people that say, this is who God is to me, like who is God to you? What is a God to you, right? It's where people come. And you have chapters of the Quran that are rooted in revelation, that these are things that even are happening during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, right? Our gods are made of this substance. Our gods have these children. The Prophet is answering these questions theologically, directly. The Quran is sending revelation. But if we had a baseline definition of what this word is, what would that definition be? You can just talk to the person next to you, and then we'll come back and discuss. Just 2 minutes, and then we'll come back and discuss. Okay? So, what are some of the things we're coming up with? So, if someone was to ask you, like, what's the definition, what would you say? And I want you to think about this, because at like this juncture for some of us, not all of us, you have to get to a place too where the answers can't be always like these deep explanations, do you know? If it's a theology that's meant to be for all people, or for yourself also, because a lot of you in this room, you've never thought about who God is to you before. And even in the first part of what we were talking about, most of what the conversation around Iman and Aqidah was attached to actions, like practice, ritual. And that's what we're given for the most part, like do's and don'ts, and right and wrong, and kind of mechanics, which is a part of it, but it's not it in its entirety. You can't have religion if you don't have belief in something, right? If there's not a belief in God, there's not like a religion there. You can come and hang out. There's people come to Jummah all the time who are not Muslim. And they're like, I like this sermon thing that you got going on. And Fried Chicken Friday is really great. And it's nice when you guys go up and down in your prayer. It's like I'm stretching out. Like, yeah, man, come down. It's not a problem, right? But the mechanics is not what brings one to religion, right? And at some point, religion has to be about God. Do you see what I mean? So if we were to start to narrow it, yeah, like what is Surah Ikhlas giving us as a definition? Yeah.
Okay, so I had a metaphor. It's so God is to humans sort of as physics are to a goldfish.
Okay.
And what that means is a goldfish is incapable of describing what physics are. But yet it is constantly, like everything that it does, it is surrounded by and controlled by, its entire reality is shaped by the laws of physics, right? And so in the same sense, we too are, God is everything that creates our reality and our existence, but we don't have the capacity to explain what that is or like to define it really, which is kind of a loophole to your question really, but it's, It goes back to the idea of faith, right? Like faith is the thing that bridges between what we cannot really comprehend or express, but we can trust is there.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
I really like that metaphor. The answer I gave is God is the source of everything. And you can take that at face value, but if you want to dig into it, you can also take everything to mean not only all of creation, but reason itself, right? Rationale, every thought, every line of consideration taken to its end ends in God, who has no ending, because God itself is the source, right? And it's also that shows how God is integral to existence, right? Because if we not only take things to be created and they persist, but our breath comes from God. So if God desists, we desist. So God is the source of everything.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Going to the example of like telling what a laptop is to a child, it's like you can go to too many details, like it has a lot of programming, there's a lot of like graphics and all that stuff.
Yep.
You would just say, okay, a laptop has a screen, it has a keyboard, and stuff like that. So we talk about God like, okay, He's the creator, He created me, you, our fathers, like in simple terms, let's say. And with time you get like more into the details.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
It's a definition for me. I would say God's the creator of all that ever was, all that ever is, and all that ever will be. As simple as I can get.
Okay. Luna, you're gonna say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say because we were trying to think of the different definitions, what sets apart the Islamic definition of God, and a lot of these things I think I would guess would apply to other religions' definitions of God, and I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned that much yet is the oneness of God, which we were talking about how it's oneness not just quantitatively in the sense that, and I don't understand the Trinity that well, but my understanding is that there's like at least 3 entities that have some type of like an essence of God, so that's like quantitatively different. But also in terms of like the quality of God, that there is only one of God's kind, and that goes back to Brother Khalid's idea that God has to be unlike anything else in creation or that we can conceive of. And to me, so the oneness of God to me has to contain both the quantitative part, but also the qualitative part, that there's only one with the qualities of God, and therefore you can't compare God to anything else.
Great. You had your hand raised.
That's what I was going to mention. Shabbat.
No, it wasn't. Was it really? Yeah.
No, but I will add on and say, like, within Islam, I think it's really great how we have all these names for God, so we can like identify Him and attribute different things to Him.
Yeah. So what we're doing right here, for example, it gives an indication as to why there's a necessity for a codified system, right? Because we couldn't go into existing in historical context and have 20 different answers to a question. Do you know? And a big part of this, which is not a problem, as to why we land in this place and why religion sometimes also doesn't feel so empowering, right? Why it's easy to pray with your body but not with your heart is because a lot of us in this room have actually never studied theology before. We've never studied doctrine before. Do you know? And if I was to ask you, you don't have to tell me if you have or not, right? But if you've ever like done a deep dive that doesn't require years of prolonged traditional study, but this is the entry point into religion, one that allowed for there to be some kind of systematic or structural approach to just understanding principles of theology and faith, right? And it's really easy to understand it. This is the relationship between understanding faith and doctrine. We're at New York University. I could take you to our Islamic Studies department. There's like these old white professors who make Muslims doubt everything in their faith because they know Islamic doctrine better than most Muslims do. Just because they know the doctrine doesn't mean they believe in it. Do you get what I'm saying? So the bridge between what is doctrinal and what is not just kind of academic is this thing of iman. What are some of the essential things that makes God different conceptually in Islam, right? This idea of God's uniqueness, His oneness, right? Laysa kamithlihi shay. There's not anything that's like a likeness to God. The fundamental idea is that everything in creation is abd, and God uniquely is ghani. So if we had a baseline definition, Allah, God, is self-sufficient. And everything is in reliance upon that self-sufficient God. Embedded within it is an opportunity to now be able to understand that God is other than His creation, because everything else is other than God in this. Do you see what I'm saying? And we start to build upon it. We start to engage it. Let's look at this text really quickly. The Book of Assistance. We're on chapter 11 on doctrine. You must correct and protect your beliefs. Just paragraph 1. Can somebody read it for us? Yeah, go ahead.
You must correct and protect your beliefs and conform to the pattern of the party of salvation. Who are those known from among the other Islamic factions as the people of the Sunnah and Jama'ah? They are those who firmly adhere to the way of the messenger of God. May blessings and peace be upon him and his companions.
So what's going on here in historical context, because books are also written not in a vacuum, but in response to things that are happening in front of them. And then when you have a connection through spiritual text or religious text that is rooted in a tradition, generationally you're also passing on this kind of concept of what you studied from a text that was written in response to a certain context. There's a lot of books on theology that are written now topically in reference to historical context of audiences that are in front of them in the immediate. There's books of theology that are written that have to be able to respond to things that come up contemporarily, right? For us, for example, we have to be able to answer theologically, why does a pandemic exist? And not to just root it in kind of baseline conversations around theodicy and the idea of suffering and these kinds of things, but in New York City, it was crazy in the first part of this. Our own Islamic Center community, some of you also had loved ones pass away. We got in the first few weeks 100 people who had either passed directly or had loved ones pass, and we stopped counting. When somebody's sitting there and they're wrestling with this concept theologically, why would God allow for this to happen? When you look at experience of marginalized demographics, why would Dr. Sherman Jackson, who's a great Muslim intellectual, have to write a book that's called Islam and the Problem of Black Suffering? Because this is an important thing to be able to answer. The realities of slavery, the realities of Jim Crow, the realities of a prison industrial complex, again and again and again. There has to be a robust mode of a theology that claims this kind of relevance that isn't just rooted in senses of culture or Islam, how does it fit in with practices that exist socially, but when things come up contemporarily, there has to be a mode of engagement rooted in what is actually in the text that explains this on a theological level. So you have a lot of books of theology that are dealing with this. And they're written both proactively, but quite often reactively. Because in the Muslim community and Muslim experience, you had all kinds of things that came up for people as they were trying to flesh this out for themselves. There was groups of people who said that there is no predestination in Islam. Everything is just off of human agency. This created like problematic elements when people were trying to understand theologically, how could there be an omnipotent God that played no role in how humanity chose their choices? There were individuals who had like purely rational arguments only. And that yielded now challenges as well. And there were those who had understandings that were very much at the other end of the spectrum, that said there's no place for anything speculative within this prism of theology. What exists within normative Sunni theology becomes like three schools of theological thought. And Sheikh Fayaz, who's on our staff, could give you much deeper insight into how this develops within Shi'i thought. That's not my expertise at all. But in being able to understand this development, you get three major schools of thought. One that's called the Ash'ari school, the second that's called the Maturidi school, and the founders of these two schools, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari and al-Mansur al-Maturidi, they're contemporaries. They live around the same time. And then a third school that's called the Athari school, that within kind of modernities, kind of understanding present day, this becomes adopted by what we know as more so like a Salafi kind of theology, the Athari creed. The Maturidi and Ash'ari creeds give opportunity to rational interjection in the development of theological principles. The Athari creed says that's not something that we do. There's no room for anything speculative. The three creedal systems, as they codify themselves, they live in a sense of harmony, where if you were to actually look at texts across these three schools, they pretty much are in understanding on most issues across the board. There's some differences. It's the same concept, the way when you have distinct legal schools within Sunni Islam, Hanafi, Hanbali, Maliki, Shafi, they make up a broader prism of a legislative understanding that is in kind of cohesion with one another, right? Not at odds with one another. That doesn't mean that things didn't get messy at certain times. If you don't know your history, you got to read it, because it's really crazy the way that you have in certain dynastic, in certain caliphates, institutionalized theological principles. That if you did not adhere to those things, it became a mechanism through which governmental apparatus was now literally like imprisoning, arresting, torturing, killing people. And there's challenges, problems that exist here. Where and how we want to be able to understand it in light of this text, Imam al-Haddad is saying, you got to know what your actual belief system is. And you have to be able to understand it within a place that isn't about necessarily negating somebody else's belief system, but being able to understand within the historical context of the development of this, as there's all kinds of questions that are coming into play, and people are seeking to understand the answers to these questions, there's still a need to recognize that there's going to be some things that are just way off base at the end of all of this. And some of these things will hit a little closer to home, right? Because some people would say, for example, how do you deal with the faith of somebody who openly is disobedient to what Allah asks them to do? Do I have the authority to make a claim on somebody else's faith? What if somebody is in a place where they are very much so abandoning fundamental actions, right? Because there's hadith that say things like bain al-mar'i wa kufri tarku salah, between an individual and kufr, disbelief, is the abandonment of prayer. And so the practice of it is ritualistic, but the abandonment of the ritual now brings up a theological question. Do you get what I'm saying? And so for ourselves to think about this in an empowering way, like a very robust way. There's a text that within Sunni doctrine becomes like a baseline text that many different schools will look at, and it's called the Creed of Imam Tahawi, rahimahullah. There's a really great translation that Sheikh Hamza Yusuf did some years ago. If people want to Google this right now, just the Creed of Imam Tahawi PDF, you can Google Sheikh Hamza's book name with it too, and pull it up so you can get a feel for, like, what does this kind of text actually say? And Imam Tahawi, he distills about 150 points that are rooted in this codified creed, right? People want to pull it up so we can take a look at it. What he bases these points off of are going to be derived from the Quran as well as from the Hadith. And people aren't familiar with how Hadith functions, right? There are Hadith that have like numerous chains of transmission. They're called mutawatir Hadith. They exist in like such an abundance of chains of transmission that so-and-so said so-and-so, said so-and-so, said so-and-so, said that the Prophet said this. And then another group of people lands on the same thing, and another, and another, and another, that it's like the most kind of solid form of transmission. That's also where they pull from hadith kind of transmissions in terms of these theological points. Does that make sense? So people want to look it up, and we can take a look at it really quick. And if you get to the first few pages, he goes through an introduction. He gives a biography on who Imam Tahawi is, and then he highlights the authorization that he has to be able to translate the text and transmit the text, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. And then he gets into the actual text itself, right? And on one page he's got the Arabic, and on the other part he's got the English translation. Do you know? And so if we're looking at it, he goes through it. Do people have it pulled up? Yeah, right? So he says, praise belongs to God alone, the Lord of the worlds, the most learned scholar, the proof of Islam, Abu Ja'far al-Waraq al-Tahawi from Egypt. May God shower him with mercy, states that the following in an exposition of the creed of the people of the prophetic way and the majority of scholars, Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah, in accordance with the understanding of Muslim jurists such as Imam Abu Hanifa and Nu'man bin Thabit al-Kufi, Abu Yusuf Yaqub bin Ibrahim al-Ansari, and Abu Abdullah Muhammad bin al-Hasan al-Shaybani. And these are, senior kind of students of Abu Hanifa and Abu Hanifa himself. It includes their beliefs about the theological foundations of the religion upon which they base their worship of the Lord of the worlds. We assert about the unity of God, as did Imam Abu Hanifa and the two aforementioned Imams, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad bin al-Hasan. May God have mercy on them, believing with providence that, and then he starts to go through these points. So, 1, God is one without partner. Inna Allaha wahidun la sharika lah. Right? You've probably heard this recited in Arabic in different places. You go to Eid, you go for Hajj or Umrah, right? It's something that's said again and again and again. But now it's starting to create kind of a codified set of points. This is who God is in Islam. When one of your friends comes to ask you, like, who is God in Islam? This is the type of book you would present to them. It gives an overarching set of principles that says this is taken from Quran and Hadith, and it's a codified set, doctrine, creed of Islam. Does this make sense so far? Can somebody continue to read? Yeah, go ahead.
Number 2, nothing is like him. Number 3, nothing debilitates him. Number 4, no deity exists save him. Number 5, he is pre-existent, without origin, eternal, without end. Number 6, he neither perishes nor ceases to exist.
Okay, let's take a stop here, right? Why are these important things to understand? And not just rotely memorize or regurgitate, because that's what a lot of people do, right? We brought up Surah Ikhlas, and if we have time, we might take a deep dive into it today, because there's a lot of people who say, if you know this short chapter, like you actually know its meaning, it's going to be a good chunk of the foundation of your creed, right? Because it goes into it in a way that gives a deep understanding of who the divine is. But the idea is not to just be able to memorize it and spit it out. If you can understand Arabic and speak Arabic, or even not, you can memorize this whole text. It's not hard to. That's the way Arabic flows as a language, But the whole idea is to utilize it also as a mechanism to build a deeper connection to the divine. Because you can believe, the way a bunch of you said, Allah is the creator of everything. Everything comes from Allah. That doesn't mean that still has an understanding that God is different from everything else. Do you get what I'm saying? There's other religions that claim that God is a creator in his divinity, but there's still a different manifestation of divine entities within those faith traditions. And you start to really think about it as it exists now within the synergies across ethics, values, principles. How does this relate to a concept like tawakkul, for example? A reliance on God, a trust in God. Not so I can just memorize and spit something out. My kids aren't here. If they were, I'd bring them down. They're memorizing Quran. And I've said this to some of you before. My son Kareem memorized Surah Ikhlas when he was 3 years old. And he was walking down Fifth Avenue with me in his stroller. He's on the subway. He's a little kid the same way. They're like singing Baby Shark like again and again and again. He's also just got in his head. This is when you memorize Quran and it sticks with you. It's just going to come out, right? And he's doing this again and again and again. Qul huwa Allahu ahad, like everywhere. Belting it out on the trains, right? People are staring at him. He's 3, he doesn't care, right? There's times he's literally sitting in our apartment, in the bathroom, in the tub, sometimes on the toilet, and he's like spitting out Surah Ikhlas. I'm like, hey man, you cannot be doing that where you're at right now, right? But he's 3 years old. If I asked him to tell me what does it mean, he doesn't know. Around the same time, we were reading like these bedtime stories, and he had a book that was given to him that were bedtime stories about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I'm saying to him, Kareem, when you hear the Prophet's name being said, you say sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he did it. And after a couple of days, we got to a place where there's a picture of the Prophet's camel in one of the chapters. And then he turns to me and he says, Baba, is this Rasulullah? And I said, no, it's a camel, right? But he's 3 years old. His 3-year-old capacity is going to function the way a 3-year-old's capacity is meant to function. When I am now 20, 30, 40, 50, my Sunday school knowledge of Islam is not going to cut it if I want to build a deeper connection to things that render contentment. Why do you want to believe in a God that is defined in this way? Pre-existent, without origin, eternal, without end, neither perishes nor ceases to exist. Your God never sleeps. At any point in the day, when you want to make dua, that God is ever wakeful, always aware, knowing of everything. When do you sit and ponder and reflect upon this God? When you're trying to figure out, why should I not be smoking this or drinking this? Why should I be giving up my sleep at this time of the day? Why should I be in avoidance of this or in a place where I'm observant of this? Everything comes back to God. And when we say it's not a sociological identity variable, Islam, you cannot inherit Islam as a religion in that way. It's a discursive theology. You have to be able to explain why you believe what you believe in. Does it mean everybody has to have a detailed understanding of it? No, you do not have to have a detailed understanding of it. You can have a very cursory understanding of theological principles in Islam and you're still Muslim. But if you have the capacity, right? Most of us in this room, we have gone through some system of pedagogical learning in institutions of higher education. You have been taught how to learn. You have been taught how to study. You have gone through it in pursuit of various disciplines across the board. Why would you not apply it to the thing that claims when you engage it, it actually is going to render inward balance? That's what brings appeasement and contentment to the heart. This is why this is a chapter in a spiritual text. It's not so you're just memorizing and spitting things out, but it has an impact back on your heart and how you see things in certain ways. Do you get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Okay, what I'd like you to do is turn to the person next to you, and for 2 minutes, what are you taking away so far, right? Just discuss it, and then we'll come back and talk about it. Go ahead. Okay, so what are some of the things we're taking away thus far? What are we talking about? Who wants to start? Let's come back. So what are we discussing? What are you taking away thus far? Nobody's taking away anything? I'm glad we all collectively wasted the last hour of our lives. Amazing. What did you discuss? I heard a lot of people talking. Yeah, go ahead.
Keep it concrete. Some of my takeaways, I have to get that book, and I have to finally buy that book. There are other takeaways, but those are the ones I definitely want to walk away with.
Yeah, and when we say, like, look up the PDF, if you have the money to buy the book, please buy the book. I'm not condoning just pulling things off the internet. This book is pretty easily accessible. And there's another text, it's called Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar, like the greater fiqh, which is a text on theology, right? That is also translated in numerous languages. But you want to start to kind of build a relationship with some of those texts and take classes. And there's a bunch you could do online. I'm happy to make referrals. We'll probably get to it at some point in the coming year because we're doing on Wednesdays like a Foundations of Islam class. And within that, right now, we're just talking about like the fiqh of prayer. But we'll move into conversations on fundamental theology as well and go through like texts like this as a way just where we can deepen and learn together and kind of reflect on these things. Do you know? What else? What else do we discuss? What are you taking away so far?
I can share something less superficial. This reminder that you offer about us maturing our understanding of faith and religion and God is something that you've shared on many occasions, and I appreciate the reminder. This time when you shared it, I think what it did for me is it repainted the notion of Islamic scholarship. And I was just explaining to my group, these guys are dope, by the way. That was just a very wonderful share.
Do you know everyone's name?
Yeah, Danish, Zach, 13.
Nice.
It was just more efficient to say these guys. These wonderful young men named Danish, Zach, and 13.
Do you guys know his name? There you go.
Okay, where was I? So it repainted this understanding of Islamic scholarship for me, because I think at one time I saw Islamic scholarship as something relegated to saints or people who were of a certain spiritual caliber and who had the means to dedicate their lives to this study. And hearing you talk about this now, I think it's edging me closer to this understanding of, no, this is not something that we should do. It's something that we have to do, and not because it's cool and awesome and because people will think it's nice and will feel smart, but because it's the thing we're all trying to search for. Like, we're all trying to excel at these different things, whether it be our profession, our relationships, trying to scratch this itch in our souls. But like, this is the scratcher. Like, this is the tool to scratch the thing. So we all need to be doing this, and maybe there's like a few of us who are gifted in this capacity, who will become scholars, but it should be a part of all of our lives, because it's quite literally, it's like water, you know? I don't know if that analogy makes sense.
Yeah, and this is the category of legality of this pursuit of knowledge. It's a fard ayn. It's an individual obligation to know foundational theology in Islam. Right, there's 4 buckets of foundational knowledge, individual knowledge, what's called fard ayn, like just ritual practice. You have to know how to pray your prayer, right? You can't pray my fajr for me. I can't pray your fajr for you. So you got to know those things. There's foundational understanding of where you're at in your like phase of life. What does Sharia say about it? You know, so if I own a restaurant, what does Sharia say about this? What does Islam say about this? Right? You're a lawyer, you're an engineer, you're an artist, you're an academic. You don't have to know the things that are not applicable to you. In this word that's key is have to know, right? It's not like one of those things where like somebody random is applying impermissibility to something that's permissible or obligation to something that is not obligatory. But if you're a doctor You gotta know, what does Islam say about being a doctor, right? I'm not a doctor. I don't have to know that. But I have to know, what does Islam say about being a father? Because I've chosen to have children. What does Islam say about being a husband? What does Islam say about being a community leader, an imam, whatever these things might be that are applicable to me? It becomes incumbent upon me to know these things, because that's a bucket of individual obligation, right? Make sense so far? A third is a foundational understanding of how to take care of your heart, right? Your inner self. This is like an individual obligation. Like, you have to know a baseline understanding of how to purify your heart, right? Take care of your inner self. And then the fourth, it's not in sequential order, but you need to have like a foundational understanding of theology, right? How can you be Muslim and it not have some element of theology to it? Do you get what I mean? And it really messes up a lot of people. Do you know? I was sitting down with a couple. One is a convert, one is born into Islam. They're married. They're really doing well for themselves, mashallah. But they hit a point of disruption in their relationship before they were married, because the guy who converted to Islam asked the girl who was born into Islam, "Who is God to you?" And she didn't have anything to say. And they're sitting in my office, and he wasn't angry or upset, but he was like, how could you be Muslim your whole life and you don't have an answer to this question? And she, now feeling a little bit more comfortable, made herself vulnerable and said, nobody's ever asked me this question before. I've never felt like I'm allowed to have an answer to this. Everybody's always the one telling me like what to think and what to believe and this and that. It can't work that way, because that's where it becomes a little bit harder then to live a God-centric worldview, because you cannot believe something because somebody else believes it. Belief comes from within, right? You can dress how somebody else dresses. We could all next week wear the same outfit, right? Do you know what I mean? We could do it. Doesn't mean that we all believe the same thing. We're going to all eat pizza in a little bit, right? Does that mean just because we're eating the same food that we have the same convictions? No. Just because you dress the way your parents tell you to dress, just because you marry who your parents tell you to marry, just because you fasted the way that they told you to fast, or pray the way they told you, or your friend does this, or this person does this, right? That doesn't mean you believe what they believe. How can you do that? Belief is inside of you. It's not something you hold in your hand. And then when you have belief, to be able to refine it, to be able to understand it at a level that is now in this prism of some aspect of it is actually an obligation. Which means that in our tradition understanding, when you stand in front of Allah, of the things that He can ask you, just like you're going to have to explain why you did not choose to pray Fajr. You can decide not to pray Fajr, but you're going to have to explain why you did not pray Fajr. The same way, you're going to have to explain, why did you not learn basic theology in Islam? What was it that was keeping you from doing that? Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? What are other things we're taking away so far? Yeah.
Something that we discussed, just like reflecting on who God is and like qualities, is that sometimes we limit God to our own brain. If that makes sense, and like our limited capacity. Like I was just saying, like sometimes it's like for me, it's easy to believe that God is real, and it's easy for me to believe Him and to like follow the religion. But sometimes when I think about the idea of like God is expansive, like before humanity. That part is just so hard to like actually conceptualize, and I think that's part of like understanding God, is that you can't really fit Him into like what you the capacity in which you understand. And I think that should actually have the opposite effect of strengthening one's faith in God's like vastness and the vastness of His mercy and capabilities.
Yeah. right? And it all stems from trying to get it to a place where some of it might be through reflection, but some of it's going to have to come from actual structured study. You sit down, you sign up for a class, you kind of read what's there. One of the things I could tell you as kind of a preface to figuring it out, you probably don't want to learn about this from somebody who from day one tells you to be suspicious of everybody else, or whose primary goal is to be able to tell you why everybody else is terrible. Does that make sense? It becomes deeply problematic, right? Within the broader framework of who's Muslim, everybody affirms, like an entry point to doctrine in our tradition is the Shahada that you make. It's affirming theological points, not ritualistic points. It's affirming theological points. And those foundational theologies are what then render one to be in a state of Islam. A very pure monotheism, a finality of prophethood in the Prophet Muhammad, an understanding of afterlife. There's other things that as you can nuance this and you read it. There's primary beliefs, there's secondary beliefs. There's certain things that have debates on them. There's things that have been debated for a very long period of time. But there's people who also take what is meant to be the most unifying concept in Islam that only exists in ultimate oneness, which is a belief in God, Tawheed, and have weaponized it as a mechanism to be able to like split people apart, right? You don't want to get into that place. There's a lot of things that have been engaged in conversation and debate for like years, decades, centuries, and certain things that might not be able to be reconciled at the end of the day, and certain things that might not be super intrinsic to your level of conviction. But there's a difference between saying that I've never touched it at all versus that I become very myopic through my engagement of it, right? The two extremes are not kind of where we want to be. We want to be kind of in a place that's at the middle and recognize the end result is so that I'm able to find a lot more depth through the practice of this religion, through the practice of this faith. Other things that we're taking away, anything that comes up? Yeah.
Something that comes up to me is this thing that you often bring up, that when you're praying, you need to understand who it is that you're praying to, and without taking the time to understand that, then what's the difference between praying to the Islamic understanding of God versus praying to, like God, the understanding of God like as a father, or the understanding of God as one of many other gods. Like, to me, it's also about understanding who we're praying to allows you to strengthen and nurture your relationship with God. And to me, a lot of Islam is relational in that sense, and it's hard to develop a relationship unless you know like who it is that you're developing that relationship with. And like, inshallah, in developing that relationship, you have that affirmative framework that you're talking about, where it's not just like you're praying because you're fearing this angry man in the sky who's like yelling at you, but you are feeling in your body that union of like love and affirmation. And to me, it's hard to have that bond or like unity without really taking the time to think who it is that I'm trying to bond with, that I'm trying to nurture this relationship with. Is it just like something that I'm doing in a vacuum, or do I have a more nuanced understanding of what it is that I'm walking toward?
Yeah, and these things become important in both like the broader frame of things, but also in the day-to-day types of things. It allows for me to bring meaning in a different way to my day, to my week, to my routine. What is it that I'm in pursuit of at the end of the day? What are my actual ideals, my beliefs, my convictions? And recognizing it not through a prism of just, I think, I want, I feel. If you don't read the Quran every day, or you read the Quran every day, it still doesn't mean that it's going to bring you to think about the things that you don't think about. To be able to start to nuance that relationship, to recognize it as an opportunity to find more depth, to be able to find resonance in this way, and to then recognize that, like, you know what? This is helping me to understand that I don't have to be perfect in order to be Muslim. I'm in a place where I can actually recognize my role in all of this is just being able to do what I do, right? And that's totally fine. But there's still got to be an end result and an end conclusion. Some other things that you can take away from this as you start to learn the theology is, one, you're going to wonder, why do people not like Muslims if this is what we believe? If this is what our theology is, why do people have an issue with this? I have gone to like churches and synagogues and temples. Sorry, hold on one second. I think pizza is here. Hello? 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 Yeah. Okay, thank you. Can a few of you go down and get the pizza? I don't think we need 7 of you to go down and get the pizza. Like 2 or 3 of you go, it's fine. Thanks. I'm glad everyone wants to run out of the room as soon as possible. When you start to think about this, right? When I go to churches, temples, synagogues, I'm the first Muslim a lot of people meet in some of these spaces, right? Sat in local communities, done things with like the Pope and the Dalai Lama and whoever else. But in many of these spaces, people will ask at the end of the conversation, we didn't know you believe in what you believe in. And I'll say to them, what you're really wanting to ask me is, why don't we like you so much? And I'll say your challenges with me have nothing to do with anything theological, because we might disagree on the essence of who God is, but we can still relate on the idea that we have a conceptualization of God, right? You can get that I believe in God, just like you can understand holidays and prayers and all of these kinds of things. It's not hard to connect at that level. And then I'll say why you don't like me has nothing to do with anything theological, and has everything to do with elements of like race and class. That's what it's all rooted in. To be able to give a deep understanding that contemporarily this persecution is rooted in anti-blackness. But if you're in a place where you don't know what you believe, others are going to get in your head and they're going to tell you what your beliefs are, contrary to what the actual text says the belief is. 2, you'll either start to be self-deprecating or self-loathing, or get to a place where religion isn't about subservience to God, but you start to make God subservient to you. And 3, you'll get to a place where the internalization of some of the bigotry can create now a self-loathing that you actually start to think, maybe it does have something to do with religion. It has nothing to do with religion. The people in your office that you're afraid to ask to let you pray, it has nothing to do with religion. It has everything to do with whiteness and supremacy. When you're trying to figure out, like, should I schedule this meeting or go to Jummah? What's halting you or what can compel you can be like a robust theology. You can understand why you're doing it and it can move you forward. But what's keeping you is not necessarily also the absence of theology, but the presence of structural racisms and bigotry. And as you start to deepen in this and say like, hey, I actually have a very beautiful religion. It actually says to me like very amazing things that are not like so hard to understand comprehensively. It's not like what so-and-so or such and such turns it into. That makes it like very rigidly dogmatic and do's and don'ts and black and white. That's what it is. But you can only give to somebody what you possess in the first place. Somebody walks in here right now, right? On Friday, somebody's coming to take their Shahada. His name is Eduardo. May Allah grant him ease in his experience with our religion. Eduardo comes and sits down with you and says, who is God to you? What are you going to say to Eduardo? If Eduardo asks you, why do you not tell your boss you need to pray your prayers. If Eduardo says, like, why are you in this place that you're making these decisions? It's not going to be easy to answer his questions if you haven't thought about it yourself. Then you might be able to give to him like things that are mechanics and do's and don'ts, but the mechanics don't resonate if there's not a base in the theology. And in the theology, if there's not an understanding of like, this is who God actually is in Islam. Not what I conjecture, not what grandma told me, but straight from the Quran, straight from the Hadith. This is who we understand. Allah, the prophets, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the angels, the books, right? The Day of Judgment. Every page of the Quran speaks about akhirah. Why? Why? Why is it immersing you in this theological belief of an afterlife? What is the point of it? If you never really sat down and have resonance, that's why it's easy to play games with people who are looking to you to be committed partners in a relationship, but you're just thinking about who's the next person I could jump to. That's why it's easy to pass by on the person that you can support and give charity to, and why you might not go to the soup kitchen or to the hospital and to volunteer. It's not because you're choosing only, it's because the theology in and of itself isn't resonating in the way that it's supposed to. How can I believe in Allah and the last day and be racist? How? How would I explain to God why I would do that? How could I believe in Allah and the last day and really understand comprehensively what a day of judgment is about and tell my child you can't marry somebody because they come from a different race or culture? What would that person fundamentally do when they're standing in front of God? How? How would you answer that question? Do you get what I mean? How do I make sense of a job that I engage in that allows for there to be exploitation of people, supply chains that are rooted in continuing to marginalize the most underserved and underprivileged? Does it make sense? The theology becomes the base of it because it's what you have as a set of principles and ideals that govern now how you make sense of this world. This is the paradoxical nature of decision making, that when you don't make a choice, you've essentially chosen. And a lot of us have unconscious beliefs right now that we're putting more reliance on the dunya, the material world, than on the creator of the world. You have more tawakkul in a dollar than you do in God. It's not an easy conversation to have, but sometimes you have to make yourself uncomfortable to be able to then recognize what is it that's compelling, what is it that's motivating me. Theology can give answers. It doesn't mean you can't be sad, because contentment, it's not meant to exist in a vacuum. Contentment coexists with sadness and happiness and grief and anxiety. The Prophet ﷺ is the most content of human beings. He's crying when his son dies. He cries when he gets a necklace that reminds him of his wife Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha after she passes away. There's so much that's there that gives an indication to his real human feelings. It just helps to make more sense of it at the end of it, because I understand this in the broader framework of something bigger than just this moment. And this is what secularism does. It doesn't just give you a society where no one talks about God, but it gives you, in this prism of secular existence, a belief that says there's nothing that comes after this. So you have to have everything here and only here. You can do whatever you want to here because there's no consequences. So does it hurt when I don't have the child I want to have? Yes, but theology can help to bring healing that gets you to a place of still understanding the world, not by its own merit, but through the one who created the world. When you're in a place where you can try to reconcile and recognize, why might not I have some of the things that I'm asking for, looking for, seeking? And where it hit me the hardest is not where I've sat down just in classes, writing things in a notebook, but when I've gone to places like Myanmar and seen people who are fleeing ethnic cleansing and genocide. When I'm in Turkey, like right after a major earthquake, and there's still earthquakes happening. When I went to the Rohingya camps, people lived with nothing, and in each camp, where there was 500,000 on day one, and now that many more years later, in all of these refugee camps, the most beautiful spaces were their masjids. And these people who had nothing, they pooled their money together to be able to pay someone to be a caretaker of the masjid. Why are they doing that? Why, when I'm walking through Turkey, did I not hear anybody say anything other than Alhamdulillah? And if you sat with them, it wasn't because they were forced to. You could feel like the conviction. And in my head, I'm thinking, man, why don't I believe in God like this? What is it that's there? And it's not an absolute understanding, but a part of it comes from, I've actually never really taken the time to engage it at a deeper level. I memorized Surah Ikhlas, but I never reflected on its meaning. I never contemplated on the text. I never spent time with recognizing what do I actually believe in as a conviction, you know? If you can get this book, it's a good book to have. It's good English, just read it. You don't have to teach yourself it, right? You can take classes, shoot me a message. I'll send you some things you could take for free online. I can send you things on YouTube where there's like literally people who record everything, right? And there's hours and hours where they've already gone through the text and you can just go through it point by point so that you're hearing. And why do you want to do this, right? So you can expand on your ideas. This is the beauty of having books and having texts, whether they're theological, spiritual, whether they're about civic engagement, sociology, like any topics. Why you want to get a library card? You go and read books of people who have already thought about things. You don't have to start from scratch. You take their ideas, you take their perspectives, and you start to think about them themselves so you can mold for yourself insights on things. Do you get what I mean? So this was one, the Creed of Imam At-Tahawi, and Sheikh Hamza translated this, I don't know when he translated it. Let's see. This was in 2007. And there's another book, it's called Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar, right? That you can get as well. It's in English also. There's also a book on theology. But spend some time with it and engage in it, right? The Aqidah becomes the base of all of this, you know? It's something that is an important thing to reflect upon. And these texts are things that present it in a very simple way, a very easy way to discern meaning from. So let's take a pause here.
We hope you enjoyed our podcast. If you're inspired by the work that we're doing at the IC and want to help keep it going, subscribe to our podcasts, follow us on social media, donate to help support us at ICNYU.org, and most importantly, keep us in your continued du'as. Until next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.